A master artisan built a prison so perfect he could not escape it. This is the story of Daedalus, a name that echoes through myth not just as a genius inventor, but as the ultimate tragic figure whose own brilliance forged both wonders and a family's doom. By the end of this epic journey, you will understand the profound and timeless cost of defying the natural order, a lesson carved from wax, wings, and unbearable loss. We will uncover how a single act of creation could entrap its creator, and why a labyrinth is more than a maze, it is a state of mind. What does it truly mean to be a prisoner of your own genius? Crete was the heart of a vast maritime empire, a world of sprawling palace complexes and vibrant frescoes long before the rise of classical Athens. This was the Minoan civilization, a thalassocracy whose power was built on the sea, a culture both sophisticated and enigmatic. At its center stood the magnificent palace of Knossos, a labyrinthine structure of countless rooms and corridors that would later inspire the most famous myth of all. And ruling over this island kingdom was the formidable King Minos, a man whose authority was said to be divinely sanctioned by the gods themselves. His was a world where the boundary between the mortal and the divine was thin, where a king could claim direct descent from Zeus and where the gods were active participants in human affairs. This was the political landscape Daedalus entered, a place where artistic genius was not merely admired but coveted, a tool for projecting power and legitimacy. The air in Knossos was thick with the scent of incense and the sea, and the courtyards echoed with the thunderous rituals of bull leaping, a breathtaking and deadly acrobatic dance where young men and women vaulted over the horns of a charging bull. In such a world, a single artisan of unparalleled skill did not just create beautiful objects. He became a strategic asset, a man who could build wonders to glorify a king or forge weapons to protect a realm. His talent could elevate him to the highest courtly circles, but it could also make him the most valuable prisoner of all, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. Long before the labyrinth, Daedalus was a son of Athens, born from its royal bloodline. His genius was not merely taught, it was divinely inspired, for he was a pupil of the goddess Athena, patroness of wisdom and craft. Under her guidance, his hands could breathe life into the inanimate. He did not just carve statues, he created marvels that seemed to possess a soul, figures so lifelike they had to be chained down, lest they walk away of their own accord. Imagine a world where a wooden statue could blink or a bronze giant could raise its arm. That was the world Daedalus built. He was the original master inventor, the Leonardo da Vinci of the Bronze Age, a name whispered with awe from one city-state to another. His workshop was a place of wonders, filled with the scent of cedar and hot metal. Here, he forged revolutionary new tools that transformed woodworking, and he conceived architectural principles that would echo for centuries. This was a man who looked at a block of wood and saw not an object but a future of endless possibility. His fame was his glory, but it was also a fragile thing, built on a foundation of pride that would soon be tested to its absolute limit. Yet even the greatest of minds can be poisoned by a single, bitter seed. As Daedalus' fame grew in Athens, another prodigy emerged from his own shadow, his sister's son. The boy's name was Perdix, though some called him Tolos, and his natural genius burned as brightly as his uncle's taught skill. He was not just a student, he was an innovator in his own right. Walking along the seashore one day, Perdix picked up the spine of a dead fish. Running his thumb along the serrated edge, a revolutionary idea sparked in his mind. Why should a craftsman struggle with crude blades when a toothed tool could cut through wood with such ease? From this simple observation, he created the world's first saw, an invention that would change construction forever. His ingenuity did not stop there. Later, while working with two pieces of metal, he fastened them together at a single pivot point. He discovered that by holding one leg steady, he could use the other to trace a perfect circle every single time. He had invented the compass, a tool that would allow humanity to map the heavens and design with divine symmetry. These were not mere improvements, they were foundational leaps. And with each of the boy's triumphs, a cold dread settled in Daedalus' heart. The praise once reserved solely for the master was now lavished upon the apprentice. The whispers in the workshop began to change. Was the uncle still the greatest, or had the pupil already surpassed him? This gnawing envy festered, twisting admiration into resentment. It was no longer about the glory of creation, but about who held the title of supreme artisan. This pride, this desperate need to remain unrivaled, clouded his judgment completely. The final breaking point came during a heated argument high upon the sacred rock of the Acropolis. Perhaps it was about a design or a new invention, or simply the raw, unbearable weight of being eclipsed. In a moment of blinding, unforgivable rage, Daedalus shoved his own nephew from the towering precipice. As the young man fell, the goddess Athena, who had once been Daedalus' own mentor, saw the boy's certain doom. In a final act of pity for such brilliant, stolen potential, she transformed Perdix mid-fall into a bird, the partridge, a creature that forever after would haunt the ground and avoid high places, a living reminder of the fall. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate, violent act born from the darkest corner of a proud heart. The murder of Perdix marked the first great fall of Daedalus, a moral plummet that would exile him from his home and set him on a path where his genius would become both his salvation and his ultimate curse. The blood of Perdix had barely dried upon the stones of the Acropolis when the city of Athens turned on its fallen son. A trial was swift and the verdict was clear. Murder, especially of a kinsman and a prodigy, was a stain that could not be washed away. The punishment for such a crime was death, but the court showed a sliver of mercy, or perhaps a desire to simply be rid of him. Daedalus was condemned not to execution but to permanent exile. He was cast out from his home, stripped of his honor, and set adrift on the unforgiving sea. A man who had once been celebrated as a demigod of craft was now a fugitive, his genius the only possession he had left. His journey led him to the one place powerful enough to ignore his past and ambitious enough to exploit his future, the island kingdom of Crete. King Minos, a ruler as shrewd as he was formidable, saw past the crime to the capability. He did not welcome Daedalus as an honored guest, but as a captured resource. Here was the world's finest artisan, delivered to his doorstep by his own misdeeds. Minos understood that Daedalus's genius could be the ultimate tool for solidifying his power. The king's rule was divinely claimed, but it required constant reinforcement through spectacle and fear. Furthermore, a strange and terrible shadow had fallen over his own household. His wife, Queen Pasiphae, was afflicted with a monstrous and unnatural desire, a curse from the god Poseidon as punishment for Minos's own arrogance. She had developed an impossible passion for the king's prized white bull, a magnificent creature that was meant to be sacrificed but which Minos had kept for himself. This was a political and personal crisis of the highest order, a scandal that could unravel a king's divine legitimacy. Daedalus, the brilliant problem solver, was now ordered to solve the unsolvable. He was tasked not with creating a beautiful statue or a new tool, but with facilitating the queen's unnatural union. In that moment, the artist became a royal employee, his creativity channeled into the service of a king's desperate cover-up and a queen's cursed longing. The gilded cage of the court had its door slammed shut. He was no longer an exiled artist seeking patronage, but a prisoner of his own formidable reputation, trapped by the very talent that had once set him free. The king's arrogance had summoned a divine punishment, one that would twist nature itself. Poseidon, god of the sea, sent a magnificent white bull from the waves, a creature so pure and powerful it seemed carved from sea foam and lightning. This was no ordinary animal, it was a sacred offering, a gift meant to be sacrificed in the god's honor to reaffirm Minos's right to rule. But when Minos looked upon the bull's perfection, his greed overwhelmed his piety. He could not bear to destroy such a magnificent specimen. He decided to deceive a god, keeping the white bull for his own herds and sacrificing a lesser one in its place. He believed his power as a king could shield him from divine consequence. He was wrong. Poseidon's wrath was not a thunderous bolt from the sky, but a far more insidious revenge. He did not strike Minos directly. Instead, he targeted the very heart of the king's household, his queen. Pasiphae, until then a figure of royal dignity, was seized by a monstrous and unnatural passion, an all-consuming desire for the very bull her husband had stolen. This was no simple temptation. It was a divinely inflicted madness, a curse that warped her senses and tormented her soul. She was a queen, yet she found herself drawn to the royal herds with a longing that defied all reason and morality. The shame of her own feelings was a prison, but the curse was an unbreakable chain. In her utter desperation, with no one else in the world to turn to, she went to the one man whose genius was said to solve any problem, the exiled artisan Daedalus. Her pleas placed him in an impossible position. How do you build a solution for a problem that should not exist? This was a challenge that went far beyond engineering. It was a test of morals and survival. To refuse the queen, and by extension the king, was certain death. To comply was to use his sacred skill, a gift from Athena, to facilitate a blasphemous act that would mock the gods and nature. Daedalus the prisoner saw no escape. His genius, once used to create living statues and revolutionary tools, was now commandeered to bridge the impossible gap between a woman and a beast. Daedalus stared into the abyss of an impossible request and began to build. His solution was a masterpiece of deception, a hollow wooden cow so perfectly crafted it could fool the senses of a god-touched beast. He constructed a frame of lightweight cypress, carving the curves and contours of a living heifer with an artist's eye. Over this skeleton, he stretched the fresh hide of a real cow, stitching it so seamlessly that the seams vanished. He even ensured the texture and scent were perfect, a gruesome attention to detail that blurred the line between artifice and life. But the true dark genius lay in the hidden mechanism, a small, secret door in the structure's side, and an internal space just large enough for a single person to crouch within. This was not a statue, it was a vehicle for a queen's unspeakable desire, a Trojan horse built for one. The ethical weight of this creation must have been crushing. Every strike of his mallet, every careful stitch, was a conscious step toward facilitating a blasphemy. He was using the sacred gifts of Athena, meant to elevate humanity, to instead twist the natural order for a king's pride and a queen's cursed longing. To refuse meant a swift and certain death at the hands of Minos. To comply was to risk a far more terrible divine retribution. In that workshop, surrounded by the scent of fresh-cut wood and animal hide, Daedalus made his choice. He chose survival, and in doing so, he crossed a moral threshold from which there was no return. His genius had now been irrevocably bound to the darkest secrets of the Cretan throne, and the consequences of this single, bizarre creation would soon echo through the stone halls of the palace, demanding an even greater and more terrible invention. The hollow heifer had served its purpose, and from that unnatural union, a new horror was born. Queen Pasiphae gave birth to a son, but he was like no child ever seen. He was named Asterion, but the world would know him as the Minotaur, a creature with the powerful, muscled body of a man and the massive, snorting head of a bull. His very existence was a walking contradiction, a blasphemy against the order of nature. The royal nursery was now a chamber of terrors, filled with the guttural cries of an infant that was neither human nor beast. For King Minos, the initial horror curdled into cold, furious shame. This monster was not just a personal tragedy, it was a devastating political crisis. The Minotaur was a living, breathing billboard announcing the queen's transgression and the king's own failure to control his own household. Every bellow from the creature was a public reminder that the king's divine right to rule had been thoroughly undermined by his own earlier deception of Poseidon. How could his people respect a king whose very lineage was now polluted by such an abomination? The scandal could not be contained within the palace walls. Whispers would become shouts, and shouts could destabilize a throne. The creature grew at an alarming rate, becoming stronger, more aggressive, and impossibly dangerous. It could not be presented as a prince, yet it could not simply be destroyed without acknowledging the truth of its origin. The Minotaur was more than a monster. It was a catastrophic problem that required an unprecedented solution, a permanent and secret containment for a living secret. Once again, the king's gaze fell upon Daedalus. The artisan who had enabled this disaster was now commanded to clean up the wreckage. The same mind that built the wooden cow was now ordered to design a prison from which this monstrous offspring could never escape. The labyrinth was no longer just an idea. It had become a grim and absolute necessity. King Minos saw the monster not as a son to be mourned, but as a secret to be buried alive. The Minotaur was a walking, breathing scandal that could shatter his reign if its existence became public knowledge. Its destruction was impossible, for that would be an admission of the queen's shame and his own failure. Instead, the king issued a chilling command to his captive artisan. He ordered Daedalus to design a prison, but not a simple cage of iron and stone. It had to be a structure of such bewildering complexity that the creature within could never find its way out, and more importantly, that any soul sent inside would vanish forever, taking the royal secret with them to a living grave. The ultimate purpose was concealment, not just containment. This command was layered with a cruel and profound irony. Daedalus, the man who had built the device that brought the Minotaur into the world, was now forced to use that same brilliant mind to build its eternal cage. His genius, which had once been used to create life from wood and bronze, was now perverted into a tool for creating a living death. Every corridor he designed, every false turn he plotted, was another lock on the door of his own prison. He was not just building a labyrinth for a monster, he was architecting the very walls of his own gilded cage, each stone mortared with the consequences of his past choices. This was creation under duress, a masterpiece born from fear and shame. The labyrinth would become his most famous work, a symbol of impossible complexity, yet it was conceived not from a place of inspiration but from utter desperation. How does a mind accustomed to solving problems of creation and beauty pivot to designing perfect, inescapable confusion? The answer would become a structure so legendary, its name would echo for millennia as the ultimate metaphor for a trap from which there is no return. The labyrinth was a living, breathing prison carved from the very bones of the earth. Daedalus did not simply dig a maze, he engineered an architectural nightmare, a sprawling subterranean world of stone designed to break the spirit as effectively as it trapped the body. This was no garden puzzle with tidy hedges, but a vast, dark complex where the walls themselves seemed to conspire against you. Corridors stretched into blackness, only to curve imperceptibly and deposit you back where you started. Dead ends were masterfully crafted to look like promising passages, their shadows hiding the cold, unyielding stone until you were right upon it. Staircases led to identical levels, creating a maddening, multi-layered puzzle box with no discernible top or bottom. It was a three-dimensional trap, a M.C. Escher drawing brought to terrifying life. The true genius and the true horror of the design was psychological. Daedalus understood that pure physical confinement was not enough for a creature of such raw power. The Minotaur could bash against walls forever, but how do you fight a path that turns into a wall? How do you escape an endless loop that erodes your memory and your hope? The labyrinth was a machine that manufactured despair. It used your own mind against you, feeding you false hope with every new turn, only to snatch it away and leave you more lost and exhausted than before. The rustle of your own footsteps would be the only sound, echoing back at you from a dozen different directions, a constant reminder of your utter solitude. You would not be hunted, at least not at first. You would be given all the time in the world to wander, to slowly realize that the exit was not just hidden, but that the very concept of an exit had been designed out of existence. This was Daedalus's ultimate, terrible masterpiece, a perfect prison born from a king's command and an artisan's damned ingenuity. But the labyrinth was far more than a monster's cage. It became the ultimate instrument of King Minos' political power, a physical manifestation of his absolute control. This architectural terror served a dual purpose, acting as both a deadly secret and a very public threat. To his rivals and the city-states under his dominion, the existence of such an inescapable prison, designed by the world's most brilliant mind, sent a chilling message. Cross King Minos and you would not face a simple execution. You would be cast into the darkness of the maze, left to wander until you were found by the horror that lived within. It was a fate worse than death, a psychological weapon that bred obedience through sheer dread. Furthermore, by commanding Daedalus, Minos demonstrated his mastery over genius itself. He had tamed the legendary artisan, forcing that divine creativity to serve his will and solve his most grotesque problems. The labyrinth was not just a building, it was a statement, proving that even the power of invention ultimately answered to the throne. This mythic structure may also hold a kernel of historical truth. Centuries after the Minoan civilization collapsed, the ruins of the palace of Knossos would have seemed incomprehensible to later Greeks. Its sprawling, multi-level layout with countless rooms, twisting corridors, and sudden dead ends was unlike anything in their own world. To them, these vast ruins must have felt like the remains of a giant's maze. Is it possible that the legend of the labyrinth is a folk memory? A story that grew around the awe and confusion inspired by a lost and vastly superior civilization. The myth gives a name and a terrible purpose to a place that to outsiders seemed utterly bewildering. So the labyrinth stands as both a brilliant fiction and a ghost of a real past, a symbol of a king's terrifying power and the enduring human urge to explain the unknown with a story. The labyrinth's true horror was not confined to its stone walls. It demanded a constant, gruesome sacrifice to sustain its dark purpose. This grim reality struck at the heart of a rival city, for the monster's existence cast a long shadow across the Aegean Sea all the way to Athens. The catalyst was a personal tragedy for King Minos. His son, the Prince Androgeos, a young man known for his strength and skill, had traveled to Athens to compete in the athletic games. There he triumphed, defeating all the local champions, but his victory sparked jealousy and fear among the Athenians, and in the ensuing conflict, whether by treachery or in a simple brawl, Androgeos was killed. When the news reached Crete, Minos' grief transformed into a cold, calculated rage. He mobilized his powerful navy and sailed for Athens, laying siege to the city. The Athenians, weakened and desperate, begged for terms. Minos' vengeance was not a simple demand for gold or land. It was far more sinister. He imposed a blood tribute, a decree that would echo for generations. Every 9 years, or in some versions of the tale every single year, the city of Athens was forced to send 7 of its finest young men and 7 of its most beautiful young maidens as a sacrifice to the Minotaur. This was not just a punishment for the death of his son. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The labyrinth was no longer just a secret containment cell deep within the palace. It became an engine of state terror, a tool to systematically weaken and humiliate a rival power. Imagine the dread that would fall over Athens as the Cretan ships appeared on the horizon. The entire city would be thrown into a lottery, a terrifying draw to see which families would be shattered, which children would be sent into the darkness never to return. The wails of mourning mothers mixed with the clanking of chains as the chosen 14 were loaded onto a black-sailed ship. This periodic ritual of despair cemented Minos' power, proving that his reach was long and his punishments were beyond any conventional warfare. He had turned a personal loss into a political weapon, and in doing so, he ensured that the name of the Minotaur would be whispered with terror far beyond the shores of Crete. This cycle of sacrifice, however, could not last forever. Such a profound injustice would inevitably call for a hero, setting the stage for a prince from Athens who would dare to challenge the monster in its own home. The master of the maze had become its most valuable prisoner. With the labyrinth complete and its horror sealed within, King Minos faced a new and pressing problem: the man who had built it. Daedalus knew every twist, every hidden passage, every secret of the stone puzzle. He was a walking, breathing blueprint of the kingdom's most sensitive secret. What was to stop him from selling that knowledge to a rival king, or from simply walking away and leaving Minos vulnerable? The king's solution was as ruthless as it was logical. He could not allow his chief architect to become a free agent, and so, in a move of profound betrayal, Minos ordered Daedalus and his young son, Icarus, seized and cast into the labyrinth's depths. The irony was absolute and crushing. The creator was now entombed within his own creation, the genius of the design turning mercilessly against its maker. Imagine the weight of that despair. Every corridor was a testament to his own skill, every dead end a mocking reminder of his intention to confuse and trap. He had calculated the precise angles to disorient the mind, and now he had to live inside that calculated madness. The whispers of the wind through the stone halls sounded like his own thoughts thrown back at him. He had designed this place to break the will of a monster, and now it was tasked with breaking his. His only comfort, his only tether to sanity, was the presence of his son. Icarus, a boy who had known only the gilded cage of the palace, now found himself in a literal one. His world shrunk to an endless, repeating pattern of cold stone. For Daedalus, the labyrinth was no longer a masterpiece of engineering. It was a monument to his own compromised choices, a prison built from the consequences of helping a queen, obeying a king, and ultimately surviving at any cost. His mind, which had once soared with ideas of flight and freedom, was now forced to walk the same hopeless paths he had drafted for others. But a mind like his could not stay captive for long. Staring at the unforgiving walls, Daedalus began to dream of the one thing the labyrinth could not contain: the open sky. The stone walls he had designed offered no exit, but they could not block his view of the sky. Day after day, Daedalus would watch the seabirds circling high above the labyrinth's open courtyard, their freedom a constant, taunting contrast to his own imprisonment. They soared on paths of air, utterly unconcerned with the maze of confusion below, and in that simple, daily observation, a radical idea began to form. King Minos controlled the land and the sea. His guards patrolled every harbor and every road, but the sky, the vast and open sky, belonged to no king. It was a domain reserved for the gods and the creatures with wings. What if a man could claim it for himself? The idea of human flight was not just ambitious, it was blasphemous, a direct challenge to the natural order that separated mortals from immortals. To even conceive of it was an act of supreme audacity. Yet for Daedalus, trapped by his own genius, audacity was the only currency left. His mind, the very instrument that had built this prison, began to work on its ultimate lockpick. He studied the gulls and the cranes, noting the elegant curve of their wings, the powerful downward stroke that propelled them upward, the way they rode the thermal currents with barely a flicker of effort. He was not just watching birds, he was reverse engineering a miracle. He saw that flight was not magic, it was a principle of physics, a matter of harnessing air and defying weight. This was a problem of engineering, and that was a language he understood perfectly. In the depths of despair, he began to gather feathers that drifted down into the courtyard, small, seemingly insignificant tokens of the freedom that hovered just out of reach. Each feather was a piece of the puzzle, a component in a machine that would do what no machine had ever done before. He was planning an escape not just from a maze, but from the very limits of being human. The man who had mastered wood and stone was now preparing to conquer the air itself. The workshop was now the labyrinth's open courtyard, and their tools were scavenged from the scraps of a prison. Daedalus and his son Icarus began a patient, desperate harvest, gathering feathers that fell from the sky. They collected countless plumes from gulls and cranes, sorting them meticulously by size and type. The longest, strongest flight feathers from the wings would form the primary structure, while the smaller, softer covert feathers would create a smooth, seamless surface. This was not a haphazard bundle, it was a careful reconstruction of a bird's wing, scaled for a human form. They fastened the feathers together with lengths of linen thread, painstakingly stitching them into overlapping rows, just like the shingles on a roof. This delicate latticework was strong yet flexible, designed to catch the air and hold its shape. But thread alone was not enough. The true innovation and the ultimate vulnerability was the beeswax. Daedalus melted down great blocks of it, creating a fragrant, golden adhesive. He used this wax to solder the feathers at their bases, locking them into the rigid leading edge of the wing frame, which he had fashioned from a lightweight wood. More crucially, he applied the warm wax carefully to the inner surface of the wings, creating a gentle, aerodynamic curve, a camber that would generate lift. This was a beautiful, delicate, and incredibly dangerous piece of engineering. The entire apparatus was a paradox of strength and fragility. The wings were a masterpiece of biomimicry, capable of harnessing the wind, but their integrity depended entirely on the wax remaining solid. It was a design that held a whispered warning, a built-in flaw that balanced on the edge of a knife. The very substance that gave the wings their shape and power would also be their point of catastrophic failure. In that sun-drenched courtyard, surrounded by the hum of bees and the salt of the sea, a father and son were not just building a means of escape. They were assembling a test, a trial of human ambition against the immutable laws of the natural world. The wax was still warm as Daedalus knelt, fastening the final wing to his son's shoulders. He looked into Icarus' bright, eager eyes and saw not just a boy, but the culmination of all his hopes and all his fears. This moment was the fragile seam between captivity and freedom, and everything depended on the words he was about to speak. His voice was low and steady, a deliberate calm meant to pierce the boy's bubbling excitement. He explained that the sea spray was their first enemy. Fly too close to the ocean's breath, and the moisture would saturate the feathers, weighing them down like stones, pulling them into the cold, unforgiving depths. But the greater danger, the true test, waited in the opposite direction. He gripped Icarus' shoulders, forcing the boy to meet his gaze. You must not fly too high. The sun may feel like a friend, a beacon of warmth and freedom after the cold stone of the labyrinth, but it is a deceiver. Its heat will soften the wax that binds your wings. It will loosen the feathers one by one until the sky itself betrays you. This was not an engineering lesson. It was a father's desperate plea for restraint. He was begging his son to navigate the narrow, invisible path between the dangers below and the temptations above, to find the middle course that represented not just survival but wisdom. The true labyrinth was not the maze of stone they were leaving behind, but the human heart itself, with its twin perils of despair and arrogance. Daedalus had built the wings to escape a physical prison, but he was entrusting his son with the key to a far more important escape, one from the fatal flaws that had trapped them both for so long. He finished his instructions, his hands lingering on his son's shoulders, hoping against hope that the thrill of flight would not drown out the echo of a father's warning. The moment their feet left the stone of the courtyard, the world transformed. Daedalus felt the first, tentative catch of the wind beneath his wings, a sudden, buoyant pressure that lifted the crushing weight of the labyrinth from his soul. He rose with steady, powerful strokes, each beat a deliberate act of will. Below him, the intricate, maddening pattern of the maze shrank into a meaningless scribble on the earth, a geometric puzzle he had solved not by walking its paths but by rising above them. The island of Crete unfolded beneath him like a detailed map, the great palace of Knossos now just a collection of tiny blocks, the harbors where Minos black-sailed ships lay at anchor becoming mere toys. The salt spray of the sea was a cool mist on his face, a constant reminder of the danger he carefully avoided. This was the ultimate perspective, a view reserved for the gods, and for a few glorious moments it was his. His heart swelled with a fierce, vindicated triumph. His mind, his brilliant, cursed mind, had not just built a prison, it had forged the key to the sky itself. Yet this triumph was laced with a wire of pure anxiety. His eyes constantly flickered to his son, a bright, moving speck against the vast blue canvas. He watched the boy's flight pattern, his own breath catching every time Icarus dipped a little too playfully or let out a joyful shout that was swallowed by the wind. Daedalus flew the middle course, a perfect line of disciplined hope between the sea's greed and the sun's seduction. He was a man balanced between two abysses, his greatest creation carrying his greatest vulnerability into the boundless air. Every beat of his wings was a prayer, a silent plea for his son to understand that true freedom was not the absence of all restraint, but the wisdom to navigate it. Yet for Icarus, the initial caution lasted only moments. The first rush of wind was a shock, but then came the exhilaration. He watched his father's steady, disciplined form ahead of him, a dark shape against the brilliant blue, and a rebellious thrill surged through his veins. Why creep along this boring middle path when the sky was an endless playground? He gave an experimental, powerful flap of his own wings and shot upward. The air grew thinner, cooler, and purer. The world below shrank into a beautiful, distant mosaic of blues and browns, and the roar of the sea faded to a whisper. He was no longer just flying, he was ascending, climbing a staircase of air toward the source of all light. The sun was no longer a distant star, it was a golden, welcoming presence, its warmth a comforting embrace after the cold stone of the labyrinth. He could hear his father's frantic shouts from below, but they were tiny, insignificant things carried away on the wind like gnats. They were the last echoes of a prison he had already left behind. This was true freedom, a dizzying, intoxicating power that made him feel divine. He stretched his arms wide, tilting his wings to catch more of the sun's radiant energy, climbing ever higher into the vault of heaven. The heat intensified, but it felt glorious, a cleansing fire burning away all memory of fear and captivity. He was Icarus, the boy who could touch the sun. Then came the first faint scent of honey, sweet and cloying. A single, long flight feather, perfectly white, drifted past his face. He paid it no mind. A moment later, another feather loosened, then a third. A strange, warm droplet splashed onto his arm. It was beeswax. The glorious, life-giving sun had become a furnace, its heat melting the very bonds that held his wings together. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The intoxication of flight vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp terror. He flapped harder, desperately, but the motion only accelerated the disintegration. A whole cluster of feathers tore free from the left wing, spinning away into the abyss. The delicate balance was broken. The sky, his liberator, became a vacuum. A final, sickening lurch, and the structure on his left shoulder gave way completely. The world tilted violently. The joyful ascent became a silent, helpless plunge. The sun, which had felt so close, was now impossibly far away, and the sea he had so carefully avoided rushed up to meet him with terrifying speed. A single, desperate cry tore through the sky, a sound so sharp it seemed to cut the very air. Daedalus wheeled around, his heart seizing in his chest. Where his son had been a moment before, a bright figure dancing in the sun, there was now only a chaotic shower of feathers and wax. He saw Icarus not flying, but tumbling, his arms flailing against the emptiness as the beautiful, treacherous wings disintegrated into nothing. The boy's form grew smaller with terrifying speed, a dark speck against the vast, shimmering expanse of the sea. Daedalus screamed his name, a raw, guttural sound that was swallowed by the wind. He dove, a frantic, hopeless plummet, his own wings straining against the air as he tried to reach his falling son. But the distance was a cruel, unbridgeable chasm. He was the master of invention, the man who could solve any puzzle, yet he was utterly powerless to stop this. He could only watch, a helpless witness to the final, awful consequence of his own brilliance. He saw the tiny figure hit the water. The impact was a silent, distant splash from this height, a small white mark on the blue surface that vanished almost instantly. The sea that had once promised freedom had now become a grave. In that moment, the soaring triumph of his escape curdled into the most profound agony a soul can bear. The labyrinth had finally claimed its ultimate victim, not through its confusing corridors, but through the very wings that were meant to defy it. The stretch of water where Icarus fell would forever after be known as the Icarian Sea, a permanent geographical scar on the world, a map labeled with a father's failure. Daedalus had conquered the sky, but he had sacrificed his son to do it. His genius had not been a gift, but a curse that reached up and plucked his own child from the heavens. The sea wind felt like a mockery now, a cold companion to an unbearable silence. Daedalus landed on a small, rocky island, his movements slow and mechanical, the great wings drooping from his shoulders like a shroud. Every beat of his heart was a drum of accusation. He had defied nature, outwitted a king, and conquered the sky, yet he could not perform the simplest, most human act of saving his own child. He scanned the choppy water, his eyes raw from salt spray and tears, until he saw a pale form washed upon the shore. It was Icarus, his broken body delivered back to him by the very waves he had been warned to avoid. The retrieval was a silent, agonizing ritual. There was no triumph in this landing, only the crushing weight of a promise broken. He gathered his son into his arms, the boy who had been so full of vibrant life, now a heavy, cold reminder of a warning ignored. With his own hands, the hands that had built labyrinths and wings, Daedalus dug a grave in the foreign soil. He buried Icarus on that desolate shore, and as he placed the last stone upon the mound, he named that place Icaria, so the land itself would forever be a monument to his failure. His freedom was utterly hollow. He had escaped the maze of stone, but he had now entered a labyrinth of grief from which there was no escape, its walls built from guilt and its corridors echoing with a single, unanswerable question. What was the value of genius if it could not protect what you loved most? The wings, his ultimate creation, were now a cursed artifact, their very existence tied to the moment they became useless. He took to the air once more, not in a glorious ascent, but in a weary, soul-sick journey toward the island of Sicily. He flew as a broken man, the greatest inventor of the age reduced to a ghost, carrying nothing but the memory of a falling boy and the devastating knowledge that some prices for freedom are too high to ever truly pay. Sicily offered a sanctuary of sun-baked stone and salt air, a world away from the echoing halls of Knossos. Here, King Catastrophic of the Sicanians welcomed the legendary artisan, not as a prisoner but as an honored guest. Daedalus, the broken father, was offered a chance to become Daedalus the builder once more. He exchanged the gilded cage of Crete for a new workshop, his genius now a gift freely given to a king who offered him shelter. For Catastrophic, this was a tremendous coup, securing the services of the world's most famous inventor. And so, the man who had fled the labyrinth began to shape the very landscape of his new home. High on a rocky outcrop, he designed a formidable acropolis for the city of Camicus, a fortress so strategically impregnable it seemed to grow from the mountain itself. Its walls defied assault, and its gates were masterpieces of military engineering. He was not just building defenses, he was crafting a new identity, one of security and purpose. His most intimate creation, however, was for the king's own household. For the princesses, he engineered a breathtaking bathhouse, a place of warmth and luxury. He channeled the volcanic heat of the island through cleverly designed pipes and vents, creating a steady, radiant warmth that filled the chamber. This was not a simple pool, it was a revolutionary system of comfort, a testament to his ability to tame the elements for human pleasure. In the steam of that room, he might have almost forgotten the scent of melting wax. Yet, physical safety could not silence the echoes of his past. Every new marvel he constructed only amplified his fame, and fame is a beacon that can attract both admirers and hunters. He had escaped the maze of stone, but the labyrinth of his reputation had no walls and no exit. His genius, the very thing that secured his refuge, was the same force that would inevitably summon his old life back to his doorstep. Far across the sea, the news of Daedalus's impossible escape was a poison in King Minos' veins. The master of the labyrinth had flown from his cage, a personal insult that mocked the king's power and intelligence. Minos could not let this stand. His authority was built on control, and the architect's freedom was a crack in the very foundation of his reign. So began a relentless, systematic hunt that stretched across the entire known world. Minos understood he was not chasing a common criminal, but a unique mind. How do you track a ghost who can reshape the world around him? You do not search for the man, you search for the shadow of his genius. Minos devised a brilliant trap, one that bypassed physical descriptions and targeted the very essence of Daedalus's identity. He traveled from city to city, from kingdom to kingdom, carrying a single, perplexing object, a spiral seashell. Its interior a convoluted, winding tunnel from the wide opening to the tiny, inaccessible apex. He would hold this shell aloft in royal courts and public squares, presenting a challenge to all the so-called wise men and clever artisans. He offered a magnificent reward, a fortune in gold and jewels, to anyone who could pass a single piece of linen thread through the shell's entire coiled length. The task seemed ludicrous. How could you possibly guide a thread through a path your fingers could never touch? The greatest minds in every land would try and fail, their logic and brute force useless against this delicate natural puzzle. Minos watched their struggles with grim satisfaction. He knew the solution required a kind of thinking that was almost unnatural, a leap of imagination that saw problems from a completely different angle. Only one man in the world thought that way. The shell was not a test, it was bait. Minos knew that the very impossibility of the challenge would act as a beacon. The reward was a lure for the greedy, but the puzzle itself was a siren's call for Daedalus. Sooner or later, word of this unsolvable riddle would reach the architect's ears, and his pride, his irrepressible need to solve, would draw him out of hiding. For Minos, Daedalus was not just a fugitive to be punished. He was stolen intellectual property, a living library of secrets and innovations. Capturing him was about reclaiming a priceless asset, the ultimate tool in a king's arsenal. The hunter was using the mind of his prey as the very snare to catch him. The spiral shell finally reached the court of King Cocalis, and with it the inescapable challenge. The Sicanian king, a man of his word, had promised the legendary artisan his protection, and so he brought the perplexing object to Daedalus. The old inventor studied the natural puzzle, his mind, though shadowed by grief, still sharp. He saw the problem not as a path to be forced, but as a journey to be guided. His solution was a masterpiece of indirect thinking. He took a fine linen thread and tied one end delicately to the body of a tiny ant. Then he carefully introduced the insect into the wide opening of the shell. At the other end, the tiny apex, he dabbed a drop of sweet honey. The ant, driven by instinct and scent, began its slow, determined march through the coiled, dark labyrinth within the shell, pulling the invisible thread behind it. In minutes, the thread emerged from the small end, the puzzle solved not with strength but with cleverness. When Cocalis sent the threaded shell back to Minos, the Cretan king knew his quarry was found. Only one mind in the world could have conceived such an elegant solution. Minos immediately set sail for Sicily, his fleet arriving with the grim purpose of reclamation. He demanded that Cocalis surrender his prized guest. the Sicanian king, trapped between his hospitality and the threat of a powerful enemy, feigned agreement, inviting Minos into his palace as an honored guest before the handover. He prepared a bath for the travel-weary king, a bath within the very system Daedalus had engineered. But Cocalus' daughters had grown deeply fond of the gentle, brilliant old man who had brought such wonder to their lives. They could not stand by and see him return to certain death. As Minos relaxed in the steaming, luxurious bath, its warmth a testament to Daedalus' genius, the princesses entered. In a desperate, brutal act of protection, they poured a cauldron of boiling water over the Cretan king, scolding him to death in the very comfort his own prisoner had designed. The hunter was destroyed by his prey's invention, a final, cruel twist in a saga defined by brilliant, tragic irony. The man who had sought to control genius until the very end was ultimately killed by the indirect consequences of that same genius, a fate delivered not by a warrior's sword, but by the hands of those who loved the artisan he had hounded across the sea. Daedalus did not vanish from the world with the death of his hunter. His story is one of those rare myths that transcends its own time, becoming a permanent part of our cultural vocabulary because it speaks to a tension that is eternally human. He is the archetype of the brilliant but flawed creator, a figure whose shadow falls across history, from the workshops of Renaissance inventors to the laboratories of modern scientists. His tale is not simply about a man who built wings, but about the inherent dangers of genius itself when it is divorced from wisdom. That relentless drive to innovate, to push beyond all known boundaries, is the very engine of progress. Yet Daedalus shows us that this same engine, fueled by hubris, can just as easily become a runaway chariot heading for a cliff. His ambition was not to be evil, but to solve, to create, to overcome. But in his single-minded focus, he repeatedly failed to see the wider consequences of his actions. He built a device to satisfy a queen's cursed desire, a maze to contain the horrific result, and wings to escape the prison of his own making. At every turn, his solutions were technically masterful, yet they spiraled into deeper moral catastrophes. He is a haunting preview of Dr. Frankenstein, another brilliant mind who assembled life from dead matter only to be horrified by his own creation and hunted by it. Both stories ask us the same unsettling question. Just because we can do a thing, does it mean we should? The genius who can bend nature to his will carries a profound ethical burden, a responsibility that extends far beyond the workshop walls. For Daedalus, the cost of his creations was measured in the life of his nephew, the terror of the Minotaur, and finally, the broken body of his own son. His greatest gifts, his ingenuity and his vision, became the very instruments of his ultimate tragedy. This is the core of his legacy, a warning etched not in stone but in the collective memory of storytelling. We are forever fascinated by the figure who can unlock the secrets of the universe, but we are also rightfully wary of him. The story of Daedalus reminds us that true wisdom lies not in the ability to fly, but in knowing how high it is safe to go. Daedalus walked through the world a free man, yet he carried the labyrinth within him until his final days. His was an epic journey from the heights of Athenian acclaim to the depths of personal hell, a path paved with both breathtaking invention and unbearable loss. We have followed him from the sacred rock where he betrayed his own blood, to the sun-drenched courtyard where he built wings of escape and despair. His story is the ultimate parable of creation and its consequences, a stark reminder that every act of genius casts a long shadow. The prisons he built were not just stone and feather, but psychological ones, constructed from the choices he made in the name of survival and pride. He defied the natural order not out of malice, but from an irrepressible need to solve, to overcome, to reach for the divine. And the price was exacted in the currency he held most dear, his family. His brilliance was a gift that built wonders and a curse that forged chains, a double-edged sword that ultimately left him a solitary figure, forever haunted by the memory of a falling sun. So where does this leave our understanding of the man? Was Daedalus a hero who used his mind to defy tyrants and conquer the sky, or a villain whose pride led to murder and monstrous creations? Perhaps he defies such simple labels. Perhaps he was simply a man, one whose extraordinary talent was both a magnificent blessing and an unendurable curse, forever trapped in the maze of his own making. What does his story mean to you? Does it speak to the cost of ambition in your own life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if these deep dives into the human heart of mythology resonate with you, subscribe for more journeys into the stories that shaped our world.